having both constraints and possibilities for political empowerment in the present context. Moreover, going by the available literature and political discourse concerning tribes in the Northeast, it can be observed that the state historiography and the construct of the field or the tribal or Adivasi subjectivities to a great extent was informed by the theories of cultural change, such as cultural evolutionism or cultural diffusionism, that which is taught in sociology and cultural anthropology. This was further strengthened by the theories of development and modernity in the context of the state, indicating the convergence in approaches of scholarly writings, administrators, policy makers, and including missionaries. To this effect, tribal and Adivasi communities initially came to be generally identified as uncivilized, backward, shy to outside contact. For example, Lokur Committee reports on this. Informed by the colonial historiography, the term tribes used simultaneously with other terms such as aborigines, primitive, and civilized acted as a framework for change and development initially. Besides, the period also saw the emergence of contesting approaches on cultural change framed by binary oppositions such as isolation, that's Alvin Verrier, versus assimilation, that is G.S. Ghurye, and the Nehruvian integration approach. Further to this, scholars also identified three approaches, namely tribal societies or traditional societies as antithetical to change. B, tribal societies having abilities and capabilities to adapt to changes over a period of time. And C, tribal societies as alternative centers of change and development. Going by the latter approaches, there are increasing studies focusing on tribal peoples within the geopolitical context in the Northeast, on aspects of political economy, federalism. As for the Adivasi in peninsular region, there are studies from political economy perspectives, which gives better understanding of Adivasi reality in terms of deprivations caused by development projects. Although Panchayati Raj has been extended and Gram Sabhas have been recognized as the highest body of decision-making authority, studies indicate that political empowerment is still a long way to go. Added to this, there are also indications in studies of political conflicts in Adivasi areas, working against the Adivasi livelihood, work, and survival. Going by this, Professor Khaka argues that there is an urgent need to go beyond socio-cultural studies to understand the lived reality of Adivasis. This trend of scholarly reflections further enhanced the need to provide a model of change and development that is sustainable and ethical. This makes it important to engage in deconstructing and reimagining history, source of lived experience of the people. As an illustration towards a positive reconstruction of Adivasi subjectivity, I would like to hit glimpse in the Northern tradition of writing history indicates that available ethnic, live world, historical narratives, also systems of embedded dialogical historiography, and the need to enlarge the idea and the process of change within the state. Mutually coexistent with the state are also various embedded emerging historiographical constructs of the field and subjectivities within the given socio-cultural reality and the political context of the region, a reality that needs to be included in it. This would entail revisiting the colonial historiography since the Treaty of that needs to be included in it. This would entail revisiting the colonial historiography since the Treaty of Yanbo 1860, 820, and the reconstruction of it and the peoples as imagined and constructed. It would involve rewriting of history, construct the region as peripheries, the frontiers, the borders, the buffers, unruly hills, backward hills, tribal areas, excluded areas, disturbed areas, etc., etc. In particular, this would involve critical culture that would work on principles of plurality against of majoritarian political centrality. To this, I have identified four historiographies that negotiate a space to construct the specific field and subjectivities under this study. Namely, that is the sub-regional historiography, 1, 2, ethno-nationalist historiography, 3, ethno-religious historiography, and 3rd, tribal historiography. To support my argument for dialogical historiography, I would like to focus on tribal historiography, the last one, that is D point. To my reflection, this approach within the state context gives protection to the political space that is important to nurture the ethnic-like worlds and the coexistence. The tribal historiography makes the possibility for cultural diversity, socio-cultural pluralism. This is embedded and consistent with the ethnic-like world and regional ecological context of the region. The tribal historiography I propose here is organic and respects cultural diversity and pluralism, and it nurtures the space of coexistence of about 200 and more cultural political entities. Now, viewed from the dialogical historiography, the tribal world in the Northeast is constructed of ethnic-like worlds defined by the specific ecological context in the region. For example, the collective memory of the pre-colonial inter-community social relationship between variegated tribes and ethnic groups in these areas constitutes the very backbone of the social structure of the tribes in the Northeast region. This situated context is distinguished by the valley and the hill landscapes, the plain areas, the valleys with its agricultural land advantages like Assam or the Brahmaputra Valley or the Surma Valley or the Imphal Manipur Valley has evolved to be a political center and provides an ethnic cosmopolitan space. On the other hand, the hill areas has nurtured a coexistent independent village political units. Economically, hill areas depend mainly on jhum cultivations, hill slope cultivation. However, the hill political nature gives space to independent settlements of villages and cultural communities across these mountain ranges. It nurtures a social world of heterogeneity, culturally and politically independent and economically self-sufficient. Therefore, ethnic world in a dialogical sense is mediated by the world views and the cultural practices, histories, and contexts. It has a cultural ethos as a frame of reference. It evolves in a dialogical relationship. Therefore, there is a possibilities in dialogical relationship, even though there are strains and constraints. And these possibilities come in the process of dialogue. As I would quote Donald Levine, page 8. In quote, he says, "We understand dialogue to consist of meaningful interaction and exchange between people who come together through various kinds of conversations or activities with a view to increase understanding. The mission of a dialogical narrative is to display connections. It may thereby encourage members of a community who share that narrative to force and enjoy connections among themselves. Yet, dialogue connects without enforcing uniformity. Therefore, dialogical historiography and change suggests that the state should take care of the diversity and adopt a dialogue to bring development and progress as an ethical principle. It should be inclusive of perspectives from within to safeguard space for diversity. In such a context, dialogue should take precedence over the majoritarian frame and create a space for convergence of ethics and politics. It should orient state structures to protect and nurture coexistence, social harmony, peace, and development. It is important also to understand about the meaningful and relevant administration and development that includes coexistence of narratives, histories, and contexts and cultures. And here I lay 6 principles of dialogical historiography. That is, first, ability to occupy a point of view. Second, diversity. Third, plural cultural and identities. Fourth, political economy. Fifth, dialogical social relationship. Third, rationality as tempered by consensus. Now, on this short note, I can go on explaining, but this is the basic idea that I would like to put forth in this short time that you have given me. And in fact, I would suggest, based on this discussion that I've given, that the change in policy in the context of the Northeast or tribe should be based on the principle of diversity, the principle of dialogue. And in fact, the Constitution of India, which has recognized this space, wherein it has given Article 244, the sixth schedule should, in fact, make a attempt. Every state should make an attempt to bring in this kind of a practice for the betterment of the society at large. And in fact, lastly, I would suggest an approach against the given approach generally understood as isolation versus assimilation. In fact, if going by the way how I am going to construct it, for me, it should be taken as a spectrum. Isolation as a space where you have a freedom to live in a multicultural context, and assimilation to that context where there is a complete domination, where there is a majoritarian domination. So for me, the spectrum of isolation to assimilation is a crucial, and reality moves from a freedom to a space where you could be anytime dominated by the majoritarian in the context of a tribe. And the line between the isolation and assimilation is actually driven by a concept which I refer to it as an integration. The concept integration generally, which comes from Nehru's idea of a tribal development, based on the understanding coming from Alvin Warrior, for me is an important concept that actually is a concept that relates to negotiation space, a space that moves from isolation to that assimilation. And if that space of integration, the space of negotiation is allowed, definitely there is diversity, plurality, and there will be a space where communities will live in a peaceful and coexistent manner. To conclude, although I've taken some more time, few minutes, I submit that tribal historiography of change constructs a field of study, tribal Adivasi subjectivities in the principle of diversity and plurality. It takes into consideration epistemologies from within, is in conformity with the context, ecologies, and ethnic life worlds. From the vantage point of the tribal Adivasi reality, dialogical historiography builds on recognition of multiple narratives, is context and therefore is ethically sound. Thank you so much for giving me this time.
Thank you, sir, for your thoughts on cultural hegemony and need for integration. All the queries can be sent in the chat box. We'll have a discussion at the end of the session. We apologize for the inconvenience occurred for some of the participants who had to enter via parallel link. Thank you for your continued support. Dr. Jose Anthony, Professor of Social Work, Sri Shankaracharya University, Kaladi, will share his expertise on the topic dichotomies of social work in struggles and movements from within. His expertise in the domains of administration, health, capacity building, empowerment, and consulting has made remarkable contributions to social work education. He has been instrumental in professionalizing culturally competent social work education and practice. Sir, I invite you for your session.
Good evening. Hello, Father Joy.
Good evening. Welcome.
Okay. Yeah. Am I audible, Father?
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay. Yeah. In the very outset, I really thank the team of Bharat Mata for organizing Bharathion with a very, very reflective topic, and also Father Joy James for moderating and the co-speakers for the inaugural session as well as the first technical plenary. And I really acknowledge all people who are gathered here to listen and reflect about what is happening in the context of social work education, social work practice, and how we can cope up with the struggles and movements from within. My topic is basically with the dichotomies of social work as a practicing profession as well as an academic discipline, and what are the in participating or initiating or in working with the struggles and movements, and basically that is from within also. So I will be focusing my presentation on three major components, that is basically with the the controls or the dichotomies on the basis of the conceptual understanding of social work as a profession and discipline, the practical dimensions where we find these dichotomies, and the third part is the educational part, the training, social work training or educational program happening. And finally, I will conclude with what social work education has to give or has to take as a stand. When I look upon social work as a profession, as an academic practice, as well as a discipline, the very basic concept of social work seems to be a process of psychosocial problem solving or a psychosocial adjustment process. Because when a student comes to the college or a university department to learn what is social work, one of the first understanding they get is it's a psychosocial problem solving or a psychosocial adjustment process. And from then, they learn the theory, the practice of solving problems of individuals, solving problems of groups, solving problems of community, or solving problems of the context at different levels. And this understanding of social work as a psychosocial problem solving or a psychosocial adjustment process makes an impression that social work is always trying to make a person who is in trouble to appease with, to adjust with. Second issue with the conceptual understanding of social work is the dependency on clinical, medical, legal models. In the initial phase of the development of social work as an educational program, academic program, or as a discipline and a practicing system, the priority was given to the one-to-one individual problem-solving process, and thereby the primary dependency of social work, which is developed in the Euro-American traditions, was to the clinical model, psychiatric social work, psychological interventions, and such things. Then medical models involving with the medical situations, legal models, and later group work also was into that. And community organization as a system came in. And unfortunately, social action as a method of social work was always treated as a secondary method, which seems to be an addendum or an appendix of community development process. And that method is not that much highlighted, or that strategies are not that much taken into the social work academic system as well as in the practice system. And the third is social work as a profession, as an academic program, always make a feel that social workers have a paternal problem settler role. We know that strategies of settling a problem. So we go to the tribal communities, we go to the subaltern communities, we go to the Dalit communities, we take the issues of the sexual minorities, we take the issues of the women community, women groups, or we take the issues of the children, we take the issues of the geriatric community. And as social workers, we all put up a system that we know the solutions and we are there to make solutions to that. Definitely, as we have a role to advocate solutions. But this understanding of we are coming to solve your problems is always giving an idea that you please get settled with we will help you to settle well. And the methodologies, strategies, techniques, and the basic approaches we have used are highly dependent on these type of things, where we really locate the right of the receiver. Only the issue of the right of the receiver, the right of the beneficiary group has come into reflection only this nowadays. And in the practical system, that is my second thinking. Practical system, the conventional intervention models are basically Samaritan in practice. Samaritan means we will help you. We always teach our students social work is a process of helping others to help themselves. For what? To solve your problems, to get settled. This perspective always give an impression that we are shaking, we are absorbing the shocks of the individuals, we are absorbing the shocks of the groups, we are absorbing the shocks of the community, and we help them to get settled, comfortable. Wherever there is a conflict between the employer and the employee, we take a role of the negotiator and we try to settle it. Wherever there is a conflict between father and the mother, we take a role of a settler. Whenever there is a conflict between a husband and a wife, or a male and female, or the rich and poor, we always try to take the role of a settler. An advisor, liaison worker, negotiator, settler, these are the terms we always attribute to us. And in these situations, we are trying to appease both sides and make an amicable solution where the problem may be there, but that may be settled for time being. And this Samaritan model always makes social worker a process. Samaritan model is always good, but Samaritan model is not working with the struggles. Samaritan model will not be applicable to the movements that has emerged in the context of social change. Very essential, needy social change. Because every social change movement or a struggle is based on the right of the people. The right of the tribal communities for their land, the right of the Dalits for their right to enter into the temple, or to enter into a job, or to get the claims, or the right of the people to work for their fundamental facilities to live in a particular place, right of the fishermen for their livelihood, right of the people living in the slums to have their fundamental systems. So a settling negotiation may not work. Rather, they want to solve their fundamental problems through this right perspective. But so far, I think social work has not really taken that approach into it. Because all struggles and movements that has emerged in the system are fundamentally for rights. What is our perspective on rights then? And the third concept is basically social work education, as far as I know, in Kerala or in India, is basically focusing on or dependent on a management system. Maybe by the individual managements, or by the religious systems, or by a group of investors, or by a government system in the government college or university departments. And usually, this educational system always want to have an obedient, comfortable students group. So they are not organized. The student group, the social work students group in Kerala or in India are not at all organized to fight even for their rights. So the trained social workers are not in a position to go for a struggling situation, or they are not in a position to go for a movement to have their rights entitled. Because we are not even aware about what is my entitlement as a social worker, because I am not trained. Social work education is not giving that type of orientations to it. And why I'm talking like this? Nowadays, a social worker in courts, being a professional, have to be apolitical. Because in the platforms of the associations of social workers in Kerala or in India, maybe of the educators, maybe of the practitioners, maybe of the so-called students associations, or different unions, different associations at the national levels. If you really start to comment on or discuss on, deliberate on a politically based issue, very quickly, people will start to tell you that you're not supposed to deliberate like that. Why? Why people are not allowed to talk like that? They say you are not supposed to talk like that because you are a professional. I'm not talking about taking a party with a political party in India. Rather, I'm talking about a stand, a political stand. I really wonder, social workers can we really take a stand on the farmers' struggle happening in India? Do we have a stand on it? Any organizations, associations with a stand on the farmers' struggle or movement? Why we cannot? Do we take any stand on the issues people are facing? Rather, we are always trying to be the safe zone of the professional identity, which we have to question very radically, I think. And we are not into the system. Come to Kerala, where we can understand a lot of issues. There are so many movements going on among tribal communities, fishermen communities, or people living in the Western Ghats, people or the systems going on with the seashores. You will find so many situations where people are really struggling. And I don't really see trained social workers as real participants in the atrocities against any community here. We are not training it. Rather, we teach the theories of the sophisticated system where our social work trained people will be comfortable to work with the organizational context in terms. Being political seems to be being non-professional. I always find how this dichotomic situation can be merged up with. So we don't know. Our students are not really aware. Our teaching community are not really aware, or the social work fraternity is not aware about the Dalit struggles, the peasant struggles, women's struggles in different parts of India. The struggles and movements initiated and crafted by the tribal people, the cultural struggles we are passing through, the political hegemony, the religious the issues we are encountering with. Even in the academic field, the disputes or the discourses between the empirical science and the social sciences, the research methodologies, and which are always in discourse with. So what I'm trying to communicate is social work as an academic program, as well as a practicing profession, is experiencing this inbuilt dichotomy from the angle of the conceptual understanding about the discipline and profession, as well as the practical exposures we give to the next generation social workers as students, and the educational programs we all keep with. Still, the traditional system used in the initial stage of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. What so far we have really taken into the system to work with, incorporating struggles, movements, or the initiatives that have emerged from the local communities and the people who are denied and exploited with their fundamental rights to live on. Maybe children, maybe women, maybe geriatric people, maybe people with psychiatric issues, maybe people with medical issues, legal issues, or from the slums, or from the tribal settings, or from the seashores, fishermen folk. Social workers have roles to play as facilitators, as well as initiators to a great extent with the struggles and movements. But I would say, unfortunately, the theoretical standpoints, the practical understanding so far is not really promoting this particular perspective of a active initiator in the system. I would say more than that, when a social worker, as an academician or a practitioner or as a student get really involved in this type of movements, they are thoroughly criticized by the professional fraternity and the academic fraternity that you are traveling off the track. You're not supposed to go for that. You're not supposed to make a comment on the political dimension of it. And I always wonder, without having a political stand and an attitudinal base, how a social worker can work in the Indian context, or specifically with Kerala context. Unfortunately, I have to make a comment like this. Our associations are not politically taking any stand, but they don't allow to take a stand also, because they are organizing things. I'm not particularly referring to any system, because they all say we don't want to have a conflict in the association because of the political correctness. What is the political correctness for a social worker? If we don't have a correctness, if we don't have that understanding, we will never really have a stand on it. And until and unless we don't take a stand, I'm sure the social workers will never fight for their own entity and existence. That's what we are experiencing now. That is what we are experiencing. We cannot even make a legislative council for us. We cannot even make a council for us. We cannot have an identity now. We cannot claim anything of this sort. And basically because social workers, unfortunately, are not getting into a party with the struggles and movements happening. And we are not taking any struggles or movements for ourselves even. Until unless that happens, we will be succumbed to this dichotomic experience of controlling ourselves from within, structurally as well as functionally. So this seminar initiated by Bharathion Mata's School of Social Work, I think, will have real light on how social workers can really work and go little more theoretically and practically involved with the struggles and the movements that's happening around us, initiated maybe by the activists, so-called in courts, and the people really who are affected and concerned, and how we can be a party to them, how we express our solidarity to them, how we really work with what strategies we have to stand with them. So as academic system, as practicing profession, as educational system, social workers, this fraternity, have to think very seriously with environmental protection movements, river protection movements, this forest protection movements, or the struggles of the people for their fundamental existence from the right perspective. Right, the expectation of the tribal communities to go for, or Dalit communities, or the fishermen communities, what solidarity we have. So this is my concerns and my reflections on this process, and I believe this is a dichotomic situation, which we cannot give it out, or we cannot really grow and grab it. We have to really deliberate on it and find some clear strategies and stands to make our next generation, at least, to be equipped to get involved. So this is my simple analysis on it. Let us try to be politically conscious also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jose Anthony, for your brilliant presentation. Now the third speaker, the panelist has not joined. I hope he will join anytime. Meanwhile, we will have some discussion. Let me try to summarize what they have said, both of them. Then we will, any questions have come, then we will ask the panelists to answer. Then we will have some general discussion. Dr. Alex, who has presented a historiographic study of the tribals and in the Northeast context. He has used a narrative, a dialogical narrative with a multiple understanding. Particularly, he was able to give a panoramic view of what has happened in the pre-colonial period and colonial period and the post-colonial period. and the alternative ways of dealing with that. Of course, it is sad that we don't have much of a written history of the struggles of people, particularly on the tribals in the Northeast. But we have an oral collective memory of the colonial period, and that's been handed down to the generations. And there is a convergence approach in terms of its ethics and politics, and cultural diversity is accepted today with the pluralism. And Dr. Alex was able to bring a new epistemology on this whole dynamics of the movement that was taking place in the Northeast. And he has also brought about certain principles like ability to dialogue, diversity of the community, the cultural diversity and the plurality and political economy that is operating. And finally, how to integrate all this information and historiographic approach into a negotiative space and for a new understanding. And it was a fantastic study because most of us are not aware of what was happening in Northeast. It has been a great struggle. And there was also upsurgence of, different groups, the Bodo groups, different groups trying to identify or to assert their identity and in terms of getting their rights to their life. And it was a relentless struggle. And Dr. Alex has very beautifully brought this dimension historically. And Dr. Joe Anthony is a veteran in the field of education. He has shown the dichotomy that is operating in the whole understanding of, first of all, the conceptually what is happening at the social work field. And right from the beginning itself, as the students come in, we teach them that this is basically a psychosocial approach and leading to problem solving or adjustment. And the basic role is one of an advocate and, the conflict management. Therefore, in the practice level, there are certain conventional models has been presented as a Samaritan model, as he said. It is basically helping. And therefore, in the teaching level, there was hardly any chance for a social work student to get involved in the social action model and in terms of social struggles that is happening even in the state, within the locality, because even the social action as a method is seen as not a main primary method. It's only a secondary method, unfortunately. So as we read as an academician in terms of Paulo Freire book on pedagogy of the oppressed or cultural action for freedom, or Saul Alinsky's approach to social action, and finally even Jack Rothman's three models of community organization. Most of the social workers get into the primary model, that is in the social planning model and locality development model, but not so much in terms of social action, because social workers have to pay the price for it. And also there was, as he mentioned very well, that is there is no right-based approach, so that one cannot really stand by the struggles. And he has given a particular specific example of the struggle right now going on in the farmers' struggle. And hardly anyways a declaration of the professional associations. And a professional means to be apolitical. That is the general understanding. And therefore, we come into the, we will stay behind in terms of understanding or making some sort of a resolution in terms of support, not directly involving. We have a history of fishermen's struggle in 1980s. And many of the leaders of those struggle it happened in Trivandrum, then moved to Alleppey, Cochin, and up to Kasaragod. Many of the leaders were social work students, who was professionals. Program for Community Organization in Trivandrum, PCO, was basically led by the social workers. Nalini Naik, Eliamma Vijayan, and John Fernandez, and all. They were quite known in Kerala at that time in the 80s. But it is fizzled out. Then we have a Plachirpada movement and Muthanya movement, Changara movement. But these movements, we hardly saw the social workers in taking a very active role. Therefore, it is a high time, as Dr. Joe Anthony has presented, that we should think of what is specifically role. We have to redefine the understanding of social work in terms of our theoretical understanding and practical dimension, and taking sides and highly involved in social action. This is the thinking that he has suggested. Of course, right from the time of the Aristotle, there is a separation of the techne and episteme. That is philosophy of practice and philosophy of knowledge. That is epistemology, theory of knowledge. And he has made at the end of this dichotomy as presented, and he also said about there is a word called pronosis, which means a practical wisdom. How the theory influences. What is the theory? We also we are in an advantageous position that we have 50% theory and 50% practice, but in a very limited, as Dr. Josan said, a very controlled situation. Where the independent decisions are not, where individual thinking is not taken place. Theory is basically dealing with methodologies and principles, whereas the practice is thinking in terms of tools, techniques, operational skills, and a reliable outcome for intervention. All these are part of theory. There is always a conflict in history. But we also know that the theory without practice becomes sterile, whereas without theory is futile. So we need good theory. In fact, social work practice basically meant for operationalize the theory that they study, but using the theory to see what is happening in terms of intervention, even the question the theory from the context in which we are. Unfortunately, as he mentioned that in Indian context, it has not taken place. By and large, we have borrowed the syllabus of the Columbia University, United States, and the early stage of social work in UK, and we are still continuing. And therefore, we need to look at whether the text can be challenged, whereas our experience can lead us into a theorization. And that will be new understanding of new epistemology, new understanding. Therefore, we need to look at this dimension, how to bring this dialogical process so that this dichotomy will be minimized. But in terms of dialogue takes place, whereas a theory that will develop not only in terms of helping individuals and the groups and the communities, but also the marginalized group who are put back into the periphery. And therefore, they're right. So it has to be a right-based, justice-based approach. It is not a charity approach, not even a development approach, but in terms of, asserting one's right and guarding the dignity. This would be the process that we need to go in the further process. Let me ask Dr. Elsa that any question that has come in the chat box or they want to ask any question, any of these panelists, then we will go further. Are there questions?
Father, the third speaker has joined. Shall I proceed with the introduction of the speaker?
Okay, please give an introduction and we will, then we will have a discussion afterwards. Okay.
Okay, Father.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Ramesh Kamble will enlighten us on speaking of, from and beyond the margins, articulating struggles of knowledge, making practices. A veteran researcher, Dr. Kamble has 30 years of experience in the academic field around the globe. His main research work on Dalit identity in metropolis, social, occupational, and political experiences of Dalits in urban setting of Mumbai's deserves special mention. His area of specialization are ethnomethodology, critical theory, and complexity theory, intersectionality debate, theorizing globalization, culture, and identity, critical cultural studies of science and technology, caste and gender studies, multi-layered marginalization, vulnerability, and subjectivity. I invite you, sir, for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I mean, there was some kind of a technical hitch I experienced initially, but I hope, I mean, yes, I mean, I'm audible to all of you. Am I?
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Like, no, because I'm working on this, I mean, mobile phones, somehow there's some problem with the, yes, I mean, laptop. Okay, all right. Yes, I mean, again, I mean, thank you very much for inviting me to this important meet. We are discussing, as I gather, the importance of indigenous knowledge practices in building theoretical, building praxis of social work. Both, in fact, I mean, yes, constructing theory for social work, of social work, as well as building the social work as practice. Since, I mean, that being the large question, I start with the, basic submission, and that is that the idea of indigenous knowledge based on indigenous experience itself is a very, very diverse kind of a field. The idea of indigenous is not monolith, it is actually full of diverse kinds of both experiences, and therefore an attempt of understanding those experiences, an attempt of building knowledge based on those experiences. So, yes, to begin with the idea of indigenous knowledge practices as opposed to a practice. Because that is what I start with. I also start with this idea that that when we talk about indigenous knowledge practices, we are also talking about experiences of people whose experiences were not so far either visible or broadly being omitted and silenced in building knowledge making processes. So, therefore, my concern is to understand as to how the experience from the margin becomes source of building knowledge not only about margins, but building knowledge about social condition, social situation, social structure, and overall society in which such an experience is being realized or being unfolding. So therefore, yes, the broad title that I have offered for this brief presentation is this: speaking of, from, and beyond margins. It is necessary to speak about margins. Uh, in other words, it is necessary to make margins worthy subject of knowledge. There is specific reason for which I'm saying this. As I said right in the beginning, knowledge was built on silencing, omitting certain kind of experiences which earlier did not find any visibility in knowledge. Therefore, making these experiences visible in knowledge making practices is important. So, the point that I'm trying to make is primarily about the perspectival shift that is required in making such a knowledge claim possible. Let me start with a very interesting story, not interesting story, an anecdote or on an incident in a film, in a black film of black cinema. From African American film, yes, which is called The Great Debaters. The Great Debaters basically speaks about the debating teams. And as we know, in 30s there were segregated colleges. There were colleges for black people, but they were only for black people. So the team of black students seem to have yes contested these debates, and they have contested debate competitions with very elite Cambridge and Oxford and other elite kind of colleges and teams from there. So in that, you have this teacher who motivates black students in taking up these elite institutions and the teams from these institutions by saying that so far the master has given you your body but has taken your mind. So therefore, it is necessary to regain control of your mind and use your mind as weapon. But in order that we do, it is necessary that we should know each other. Now, there is this particular scene where this teacher is asking background of all these all his students, which are both boys and girls. But while all of them they have said something about it, they ask the teacher, "What about you? You have not said anything about you." So she says, "We are people without records. There are no records. No one has seen us, as worthy of being recorded, being recognized. Since now that speaks about the idea called what happens to the margins. Our margins have not only not been recorded, not been rendered invisible, it appear as if they do not exist. Okay, or it need not to be spoken about, at least. Yes, I mean, while speaking about the, yes, while discussing about the knowledge. So, first of all, speaking of the margins becomes extremely important in constructing or in making the knowledge uh, possible from the margins. Making yourself as worthy subject of knowledge is extremely important, an initial state in which you become subject of knowledge. Yes, I mean, this is also very important. Yes, I mean, is how is it that you become subject of knowledge? With lot of struggle you have, because of your struggle, at least in case of blacks and tribes, I mean Dalits and tribals, for example, with lot of social struggle, that they have now been recognized and recognized as worthy social subject, worthy subjects to be recorded, to be taken note of, to be discussed, and to be dealt with. Okay, so it is with this great struggle, it is with consistent struggle, that you have made yourself worthy of being recorded, worthy of being object of knowledge. That you become so your experience become a source of knowledge. All along, yes, your experience did not count, and it did not become worthy basis for building knowledge. Hence, it is in itself a great struggle to make yourself worthy of worthy of worthy of subject matter of building knowledge making practices. Hence, I think the first struggle, therefore, from the margins is to make your experience as basis of knowledge. Yes, I mean there was this Dalit poet called Namdev Desai. He had he became famous. He was also a poet, and all the initial panthers were both. In fact, I mean they're poets. They're yes, I mean they are I mean, critiques, and also they were activists in the movement. So when they became when so he had written this poem called Golpitha. Now, sorry, not poem. This is book of poetry collection called Golpitha, and he wanted us known Marathi some literature, Vijay Tendulkar, to write a preface for it. When Tendulkar went through the poems that Namdev Vasal had written, he realized he somehow doesn't understand the words that he had written, as if they were in world of different language. Though he had written that in the same language, but the words appear to have been written in different kind of language. So therefore, he was puzzled that how is it that
What happened? Have you lost connection, sir? Dr. Ramesh? Is frozen. Okay. Sir, you can speak now.
yes, I mean
Okay. Okay.
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. No.
Okay. Yes, I mean there was some yes, I mean there was some problem there. Right. So I mean what happens is that Tendulkar realized that the word that Namdev Desai was trying to somehow he had assumed that it did not exist. Not only that, oh, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, hello,
Yes,
hello.
sir.
We can hear you, sir. Very
Right.
clear.
So he had assumed that the world that Namdev Desal was trying to portray just somehow did not exist. Not only that, he had assumed the primacy and the primary existence of his own world. So he said, by this knowledge practice, I had erased that whole experience. I had erased that life itself. So margins, in a way, did not become part of my thinking process. I had assumed as if that world did not exist. So, or I had assumed that only my world exists. Okay. Now, this, therefore makes it extremely important. M.N. Srinivas, who had written about Indian villages, okay, Indian villages, had also, later had written that when he talked about Indian villages, he was talking about his own location in that village. Whereas villages in India have multiple kind of locations. They are basically caste locations. Okay, so there are villages within the villages. But Evan Srinivas, when he was talking about Indian villages, he was talking about his own primary location in that village. Now, this means that the privileged knower as subject, knowing subject, had already assumed that only their world exists and that it is that world and the experience that emerges from that world is something that ought to be taken as the worthy basis for building knowledge. I think, so therefore, the point I'm trying to draw your attention to is this, that to speak about margins is a first step to register it as the worthy worthy subject matter for building knowledge. Okay, so therefore the first struggle therefore is not only to acquire space within society, acquire space in knowledge making practices itself is an important, important, both in fact, political and theoretical activity. Here, in fact, theoretical activity also simultaneously becomes a political activity. It is actually contesting knowledge power. So in that sense, it becomes an important political practice, knowledge political practice, which means has to be made. Speaking about becoming worthy subject of knowledge does not necessarily, mean that your experience becomes becomes authentically available for knowledge making practices. Often, for example, locations from gender, locations from caste, locations from race, for example. That is, margin locations from gender, margin locations from caste, margin locations from race, have often found it that with great difficulty, with consistent struggle, they have been able to find place in the discussion, that the discussion about them, but the discussion about them is about them. The discussion is not about the society that has created a particular kind of social experience. So when we talk about, African Americans, we talk about African Americans, not the society which is rooted in systematic and structural of racism. Is okay. So instead of talking about racism, we talk about we talk about blacks, or we talk about African Americans and their rights. Instead of talking about caste and untouchability as part of a social practice, we talk about we basically talk about the experiences of the rich. So it is necessary, first of all, not only to become visible, not only to become worthy subject of knowledge making practices and processes, or to engage with those processes. It is also necessary to 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 basically see. So this is seeing. This is speaking from the margin location. Speaking from margin location is to speak about the society, the social processes, the social relations through which or from which such kind of experience emerges. This experience emerges from particular kind of society. It is not the experience. Yes, I mean it is not the victim of that social order who is the problem, but the society that has created a specific kind of victimhood, that is the problem. So it is necessary to understand. It is necessary to understand the social structure, social relations, and everyday social practices as basis for creating particular kind of experience. So speaking from locations is to speak about society from which such locations emerge, or speaking about margins is to speak about society that has created that margin. Okay, so it is necessary for us to speak from margin locations is to actually is to actually is to actually speak about the broad social structure and social relations which create margins. Okay. Often, for example, in this whole processes of inclusive development, or studying social exclusion and engaging inclusive practices, we look at the victim as the focus of our efforts. We don't look at the social order that creates and breeds social exclusion. It is necessary to understand the social relations and social structure that breeds that kind of yes, I mean it breeds particular kind of experience. So speaking about margins, or speaking from margins, is to simultaneously speak about the social order that has created the margins. Speaking about untouchables, for example, is to speak about untouchability. Speaking about inequalities and hierarchy is to speak about caste as a system rooted in social, material, political, structural basis of society, and that has systemized, yes, I mean that has systematically structured the hierarchies in terms of claims, and hierarchies in terms of rightful claims, actually, and hierarchies in terms of claims to both resources and respect. So speaking from margins is to speak about social structure and relations that have created that margins. Speaking about margins also has another dimension. Now that dimension is to speak about the other margins. One margin location is impossible to be. Yes, I mean one cannot make sense of a margin locations unless you see these locations as linked with other margin locations. You see this in terms of intersectional. You see them in terms of intersectional, in terms of intersectional characters. Both, for example, race, class, and gender are co-producing, co-impacting, and co-constituting categories. One, in a way, builds into the other. As a result, you understand them primarily as interrelated, as co-constituting categories. Hence, it becomes necessary for us to understand that speaking about margins is to speak about other margins, but also simultaneously speak about the social structure and social relations, which in a way construct and create those margins. it becomes therefore necessary for us to understand. Yes, I mean to understand this kind of a reality. Yes, I mean, so my submission is that speaking about margins, speaking from margins, primarily, yes, I mean, makes engagement with broader social structure, engagement with and social relations that particular social structure has created as an important uh, knowledge intervention in order to make margins visible, margins knowable, in order to build knowledge about the margins. So therefore, I am saying that speaking of margins is extremely important because they were rendered invisible, they were omitted and silenced. So, it's speaking about margins becomes an important knowledge intervention. At the same time, so one needs to speak from that location because those locations were rendered invisible. They did not exist in the knowledge making practices. So they have to be. These days we talk about gender economics, we talk about gender budgeting, we talk about gender mainstreaming, we talk about gender mainstreaming. So the similar way, you have to understand one margin cannot be understood unless it is seen as related to other margins. But not only margins, margins and center both are correlated, co-constituting categories. So speaking about margin location is to speak about society and social order. Unless one engages with social order, it is not possible to speak about margins too. So hence, my submission therefore is building knowledge practices. Building knowledge practices rooted in indigenous experiences basically is a very very serious kind of a serious kind of engagement because it demands a broader concern. It demands broader engagement with knowledge that encompasses both margins and center at the same time. It therefore requires knowledge as an critical interventionist strategy. Unless that happens, it is not possible that we can speak about the margins. I think I'll stop here and we can take up some questions if they are. Yes? Should that be fine? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Sure.
Okay, that's right.
Sure.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Ramesh, for your profound presentation on constructing theory with practice, basically from the indigenous knowledge point of view, and how the margins, experience of margin become important in this knowledge building process.
Yes.
They are not just the objects of our study, but the people become the subject, real subjects. So that in this process, the location become important, location of the margins. You cannot, talk in abstract terms, but in a very specific, concrete terms of understanding the caste community or the untouchability, like the Afro-American system that we talk about, racism.
Yeah.
So race, class, gender are all interrelated categories. They are known as the other margins with a social structure and its relationship. So the relation between the margin and center become very important. They are correlated. Otherwise, you cannot really study this dimension. So a critical interrelated understanding and strategy become important in the whole process of the knowledge building. So I will stop here and we'll ask the participants to ask any question. Dr. Elsa, do we have any questions so far? I don't see anything in the question box.
Father, there is no, there
okay.
are no questions
So
in
we
the
can
chat
ask
box, but the participants can
they want to ask a
directly
question.
raise
They have
their
just,
hands and
they have just unmute and ask the question. You can ask any of these panelists, three of them. Okay. Who want to ask the question? We have 15 minutes more. Okay. Anybody want to ask? participants? We have 88 participants at the moment. I don't see any hand raise or talking anything. All right. So if let me ask a question now at the moment. Now I'll start with Professor Ramesh. See, we have the margins. We don't have much of historical evidences. Although there were a lot of struggles that happened all over the country, especially in the colonial period, even the post-colonial period. Now, more on we have the oral traditions and the folklore culture and all. So, how do you see that this is constructing the history of the struggles of the margins and how it is they are interrelated? Especially in the caste system, you find that we have so many castes and subcastes, and there is also struggle among the castes within the caste itself for hierarchy. So are they looking only from the social prestige, social positioning, or in terms also economic and other social development that is become inherent in this struggle? How do you see this process?
All right. Yes, I think this is a very important question as to how do we understand the logic of hierarchy, logic of inequality, logic of logic of identities coming from the very location. Coming from the ideology that has marginalized that location. Okay, in other words, what you are asking is, why is it that those who have become victims of hierarchical practices, those who have experienced denial of their basic rights because of particular kind of hierarchical social ideology, why is it that they reproduce that ideology and assume and try to construct their own identities through this kind of practice? The reason is the dominant ideology becomes dominant not only by forcefully imposing itself on all other locations, basically the margin locations. In order that it becomes an ideology for all the groups, even the margin groups also will have to, in a way, internalize that ideology and become an agent of reproducing that ideology. For example, in case of a gendered social relations or gendered social world, women have to not only be victimized by the patriarchal order, women will have to reproduce patriarchy as an ideal form of being, as an ideal form of social being. It's only then the patriarchy becomes acceptable or patriarchy becomes part of social order. Till it receives resistance, it does not become part of social order. In order that it becomes part of social order, it is necessary that victims who internalize the ideology, they become agent of reproducing that ideology. So the concern, therefore, here is a kind of a critical consciousness where you learn, you have this kind of a critical consciousness where you become conscious of your experience, but you also become conscious of social structure and social relations that reproduce that kind of experience. So this critical kind of intervention is extremely important. A dominant, a dominant social ideology, for example, racism or casteism or gendered, or patriarchy, would always want to, in a way, accommodate the victims, make victims internalize the ideologies in which this victimization has taken place. Now, therefore, it requires this kind of critical intervention on part of those who are at the margins to become conscious of their own experience and become conscious of. So building, yes, I mean building social practice requires this kind of consciousness about the okay, about the dominant ideology, which now speaks through you, meaning margins will have to reproduce that ideology. That is the logic. You see, now the central concern here to acquire this kind of critical intervention where you become critically conscious about your experience and at the same time conscious about the social order and the relations of power actually, and relations of power that operate in those social relations. So here, and this kind of critical kind of consciousness is something central in building knowledge from margins and knowledge about margins. Yes, I mean, okay, I hope, yes, I mean, this answers your question, but I mean, that is what I have to say. Yeah. Yeah. Meaning it requires this kind of critical intervention
Yes.
on part of victims to self-realize. No, yes, I mean, there is this very famous dictum by Malcolm X, who said black is beautiful. He said
Yes.
black middle class had started hating themselves, had started hating their own dark skin, had started, I mean, hating their curly hair, started hating their. So they were self-hate. Why? Because they were subjecting themselves to the standards of other in terms of in terms of claiming their identity. So Malcolm X had to say, "Look, black is beautiful. Your dark skin is beautiful. Your snub noses are beautiful. Your thick lips are beautiful. Your skin, your fuzzy hair are beautiful. First of all, learn to respect yourself. Learn to now. That is an attempt of building critical agency, attempt of building critical consciousness about self. So why is it that it will reproduce itself? Because it is necessary for the dominant order to reproduce itself through its victims. It's only then it becomes acceptable. It's only then it becomes that is the way it operationalizes itself.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh. It was very good, your brilliant answer. I just want to ask Dr. Josandani, you have very well presented the situation in the scenario of social work education, particularly in Kerala and other parts of the country at the moment. With a very limited space for social work students and even the teachers to get involved, leave alone become part of the struggle itself. What is the way forward? Do you think that anything that is possible at the moment? Even we don't have enough theoretical base, but actually from the experience itself, evolving a process of understanding things like that. Is it possible? How do you see it as a professor at the university?
Yes. I hope, am I audible?
Yes, you are clear.
Yeah. 2-3 ways we can work with. One thing, we should consciously introduce the leaders of the struggles and movements from different domains to the students through interactions, through small lectures, or sometimes living together. We do practice such things may not be at a great extent, but we do practice that in the university. Every year we bring the leaders of different movements to our campus and we make our students get familiarized with it. Second method we apply is that right now a struggle is going on there in the Alapad area, where our teachers, students go and stay there maybe for 1 or 2 days, and some of our students and alumni are really taking leadership in that movement. Third, we have a system of bringing in representatives who take internal initiative systems from the minority communities, maybe sexually minority communities or socially minorities, or they may be living in the peripheries of the social system, or the geographically remote communities, fishermen and different forms. And they bring their problems to the students community. And many a times we make our students go and experience such situations individually. We don't make institutional restrictions to that grade. Rather, we facilitate them to go. This is one area where we can really give field exposure to our students. Second area is the associations have to make stands and help the students to take stand. Maybe they will be organizing themselves and fighting for their rights in the beginning, and they may join with the movements and take political stands in the system. If that is to be done, the management, the teaching fraternity, and the practicing people have to be organized in that line. Only then this will be happening. Third, the so-called cliche of professionalism have to be re-looked by the so-called practitioners and academic systems and associations, and should give space for people to deliberate on these issues in the platforms. And this is not a conflict, rather this is a discourse. Social work profession has to accept it as a discourse rather than a conflicting issue in the system. Why should we conflict on our political stance? Rather we can discourse, or we can have discussions on this. These are the 3-4 days. Fourth, I think students should be consciously given assignments to study these movements and make learnings from that. One of my experience in the department is that we had a national conference on reposting social work profession and curriculum by NAPSI, or it was in collaboration with the NAPSI. And when we went for the souvenir, what we did was we divided the entire students group into different small segments and asked them to bring the history, the development, the learnings, the strategies used and all of different movements in India. And that was the major content of that souvenir. Students prepared small write-ups on different movements in India, and that have been printed and published as the souvenir of that conference. So different ways we can make our students get involved, as well as we can also, as teachers and practitioners also can get involved, so that new models will be coming. And as we discussed, instead of taking a theory to the field, we will learn to take theories from the field, from the margins, maybe from the struggles, from the movements that is happening with. So the profession and the academic system, or the discipline, has to understand the dichotomy and slowly work upon it, theoretically, practically, giving the next students community involved, the teachers community involved. And finally, I would say the students may be permitted to associate themselves as a force in the system. If they get that force, they will definitely go into that. We have experiences and examples from the students' associations or students' political working in different campuses in Kerala and in India. They will fight, they will organize, and they will do this. So this is what I think about it.
So thank you, Dr. Josani, for your beautiful answer in terms of very practical and strategically. Let me ask a question to Dr. Alex. That you are...
Sergeant, excuse me.
Can I ask?
I have a question.
Somebody question? Oh, Elsa, yeah. Can you ask a question? Yeah.
Okay, Father. My question is to any all the three speakers can comment on that. This
Ah,
is partly it has been raised by father, but and Joe Sandy sir has also given some inputs on that. But still, my in within me it reflects always, and it has a what are the obstacles which stands in between, to incorporate these ideas or these kind of challenges. We have ample literature talking about the anti-oppressive social work. We have qualitative research strategies. We have, like Josanne sir pointed out, we have enough and more field activities that help students to contemplate and reflect on this. Recently, I had an experience while I was writing an article, and the framework of the article was critical social work theory, and it has been reviewed as India or Kerala doesn't have that kind of a background. Then why do you use this framework? So that was something which surprised me, something which I could not agree at. Why Kerala or India does not have a critical social work theoretical framework, and such kind of an idea cannot emerge from a locally, or having a so when I replied to that comment, I said Kerala's or India's social structure has got a lot of marginalized communities expressions, or a lot of what do you call marginalization experienced by different communities. The reviewer was not able to internalize or accept that idea, so I had to even change my the whole what do you call the whole thought of the article. So even now I find it very difficult, and I want to ask these our speakers, eminent speakers, what are those obstacles which stand in between, when we have enough experience and when we have enough evidences that can incorporate into the literature. What makes us, what are those obstacles that stand in between to standardize it or incorporate into the curriculum, the macro social work skills and practices and the realities. Where does it where do we stand, and what we can do many things, but still it is still it is a question that why we are not doing, or where do we stand and what stands in between.
okay, good, Dr. Elsa. I will ask Dr. Alex to respond to that from the Northeast point of view, if you can, because of course now you are in Tata, TIS and Bombay. Some of us studied there. Yes. Can you unmute yourself, please? Unmute yourself and speak. You are muted. Unmute. Go to that red button and click.
Sir, you are muted.
Alex sir, down. Just look down. Video symbol.
Okay,
and
now it's
audio.
okay. Now you can speak. You are unmuted. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, that was a good question. Just let me also add my reflection on that. Since we are all social workers and coming from social work, actually I was inspired by Professor Ramesh Kamle's idea of knowledge building from margins. Actually, that fits very well. Actually, the question to us for social workers in India is, what is our knowledge base? I think that's a very crucial. I think Elsa has highlighted very clearly. Before we go into the question of what are the challenges that we face, I just want to ask the first question: what do we have a knowledge base as a social work discipline, as a professional social work? Do we have a knowledge base? Now, if we ask that question, we realize that, you're looking at the literatures, actually we still, although we know that we are dependent on the knowledge base that was created in the, Western European context, we still, it looks like still dispersed, and we are not still able to decipher like, some of the schools and disciplines would have done it. Like I would say, in the Western context, people have started talking about, like Robert Molali or Lina Domileli, they start talking about critical social work, structural social work, feminist social work. Now they are talking about environmental justice. Now, where are we? What are we talking about? Now, in that kind of a context, for me, the challenge that we just talked about, unless we build our knowledge base on what Professor Ramesh Kamble had talked about. If our knowledge base is not coming from the margins, I think we are still dependent on the knowledge base of the Western European, context, which is very, very different. And definitely, if going by that criteria, then we would not be really effective. Therefore, in my opinion, of course, this is my area of work also. So for me, the knowledge, the Dalits, the tribes, what is the knowledge that's coming from there? Have we included this knowledge in our social work? Are we talking about Dalits and tribes? Are we talking about critical social work or structural social work in the way how Professor Ramesh Kamble would have, and also in the way how I'm talking about, there's so much of knowledge. Actually, there is no dearth of knowledge for social work. So as rightly pointed by Jose Anthony, so this knowledge that was given to us, received knowledge, of that psychosocial and other things, and then we have been structured to think that these are the primary and the rest are secondary. We have been completely framed and we're not able to think. Now, as long as we don't become producers of knowledge, we will be always receivers of the knowledge coming from the Western European context. And I think that's a very big deal for us as social workers. If we really want to make sense in the Indian context, we need to locate ourselves in the Indian context. In fact, I also have written in British Journal of Social Work lately on, social work approach, context-sensitive social work, location-sensitive social work. These are some of the things that we are talking about. Dalit social work, empowerment social work, tribal Adivasi social work. So these are theories that are emerging, and I think it's actually too late that we need to include this part of the theories in our curriculum and start thinking about this instead of talking about Mary Richmond and group work, case work, and like this. So that's my. I don't know how much I make a sense to you. That's my humble submission, and this is the practice that we now struggle here in our center. Our center is, we have our MA course, it's called Dalit and Tribal Studies and Social Work. So that's how we engage. So that's my humble submission.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. So now we have 8 past 5 minutes exceeded. Arya, do we have time for that, or we close it now because it's supposed to be 6:30 to 8, this technical session? Arya, can we go for
if there are more questions, then we can maybe for 5 more minutes.
We have no question, more question, but maybe we can allow the panelists to respond to the question of Dr. Elsa.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please. Dr. Josani, would you want to say anything more? Because I think you have made enough thing. Okay, you please.
It's not
the question of Dr. Elsa in terms of particular theoretical frame of the Indian context.
It is not basically to the question raised by Elsa, but I have to comment on the approach of the reviewer who made a review on an article which based on a radical social work theory.
Yes.
That in Kerala and India we don't have that practice, and I really doubt that review basically. And to Elsa, a review. If you change your thinking based on a review like this, you are not really putting in your effort in that line. Instead of going for that publication, you stand on your thinking and proceed with. We have ample experiences and examples of struggles and movements from within in Kerala context and Indian context. And we have theories, we have practice models, we have practice experiences, but unfortunately, they are not well documented as social work intervention practices. So it's our responsibility to document them as social work practices. Very recently, one of my students have done a PhD on river protection movements in Kerala. Her thesis is that. She has taken 5 river protection movements in Kerala and she has made a study on that, how people have made on that. So it's not, I don't really subscribe the argument that we don't have theory or we don't have theory.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Josanani. Dr. Ramesh Kamble, do you want to make any comment on that? Yeah, you are muted. Okay.
Right.
No.
Yes. I mean, I definitely agree. Also, yes. I mean, with the other panelists. But once again, I reiterate that knowledge is a political practice. Yes. I mean, everything is political practice in the sense it is an attempt of critically questioning the relations of power operating in society and in social institutions as well as in knowledge-making institutions too. Unless that engagement takes place, it is not possible that we can. Otherwise, the idea of instrumentalist vision of knowledge, where knowledge is to do something, I think that is an important aspect of knowledge, but knowledge has to be seen both as a context of power and also something that reiterates and legitimizes the relations of power. So unless that kind of, and unless you look at knowledge from, from that perspective, as a critical engagement with relations of oppression and relations of exploitation and relations of dehumanization, it is not possible that we actually engage with the concerns that we are fighting for. That's what would be my broad comment.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you all the 3 panelists, and it was a nice reflection. And of course, now we will go for the vote of thanks and conclude the session for today. Arya? Miss Arya? Okay.
We hope you all had a fruitful session. Thank you all the dignitaries for their thought-provoking inputs to develop our profession. Thank you all the participants for your active participation. We'll continue our discussions and deliberations tomorrow. Tomorrow's theme, social work practice with diverse groups and communities towards an inclusive approach. Happy seeing you all. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you all. Good night. Good
Yeah,
night.
thank you.
So thank you once again, all the 3 panelists. It was great.
Thank you.
Dr. Alex, Dr. Ramesh, Dr. Josanani, thank you.
Thank you, Father Joy, for this wonderful coordination of ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simichan. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. God bless.